All right. Assalamu alaikum. Yaxshi turvatamslar. That is to say, hello there. How are y'all doing? My name is Deeves Collins. Use she, her pronouns, please and thanks. And yeah, I want to make it super clear right at the beginning. I am just a lay person. I started getting involved in these issues just about 2 years ago, a little short of 2 years ago. Um, it began for me with learning the language. I was in the market to learn a language, and I thought, I remembered the news that I had read about the genocide against Uyghurs. I didn't know that much about it at the time, and I've spent quite a lot of time since then just really trying to immerse myself to the extent that it's possible for an American who is, based in America. In the current climate. There's so much I could say. There's for everything I'll say here. There's easily 5 things I won't have time to say. So I'm going to speak in 4 parts basically. The first 2 are going to be a factual overview of first the genocide itself, and then the international response. I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to that than I otherwise would, because this is a model UN group, so that'll be of interest to you guys, and you guys might know in some respects a little bit more about the mechanisms at play with the international response than I do. After those first 2 parts, I'm going to really change gears away from looking over the facts and transition to sort of processing this as individuals, processing overall. There's a lot to process, and I guess hopefully leaving with a healthy outlook that an individual might have on the entire situation, because it's really mind-bending stuff. It is easily the most complicated issue I have ever put my mind to. So I'm gonna, for the first half, yeah, sorry. I am recording on my end, yes. Um, if everything goes to plan, it should. It should. I tested it yesterday, so it should be fine. All right, so for the first half, I've got a couple slides. They're not the most gorgeous. I certainly could. I've done better, but it should do. It should do. And there's nothing super critical in these. They're just sort of to provide some supplemental information, some visuals, mostly headlines. A lot of it is headlines, just to sort of timeline things a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to sharing my screen like I was a moment ago. Yes, and come over to... All right, can you all see my screen? Awesome. All right, so starting off with just who the Uyghur people are. Right here I obviously have the Uyghur people. This is how one way we could write this in the Uyghur language. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse. That would be good to know in advance. Are you guys able to see where I'm gesturing with my mouse? You are. Okay, so that will be something I can use throughout this. All right, so this would be pronounced Uyghur Khalqi. This would be like Uyghur people, Uyghur folk, basically. This is just a sort of smattering of quickly identifiable visual, I don't know, signs, I suppose, of who we're talking about. So here in the middle, this is the flag technically of East Turkestan, which I'll talk about in a moment, but generally taken to just stand for the Uyghur people in general in the modern time. We'll talk momentarily about like where this came from a little bit. But over here we have an Uyghur person holding an Uyghur instrument called a dutar, and wearing both of these people are wearing a very iconic sort of Uyghur hat called a dopa. Obviously the rest of this person's outfit is more like Western, so this is sort of a hybrid of traditional Uyghur culture, but I take it this is someone who performs music in modern times and potentially most likely outside of Xinjiang. This is more like just a traditional outfit for an Uyghur woman. The kind of silk she is wearing is called atlas, I believe I'm pronouncing correctly. Um, and yeah, this is just a very good representative photo of like Uyghur women's fashion. Um, and over here, food is just a major part of Uyghur culture. That's definitely there's a ton of pride and yeah, a ton of pride in the national food. This is we're looking at legmen, which is even among Uyghur food like the famous dish. If you know nothing else, if you've had nothing else, you'll try legmen. That's what you'll be offered first, most likely. And down below that is a very decorative form of naan. I believe not the only kind of naan that you'll see. Naan just meaning bread, but yeah, just not going to go into too much more detail there. And down here, I have a picture of a place called Altın Mosque in Yarkent. I don't. I just chose. There's nothing I have to say in particular about this mosque necessarily, as opposed to others. This is just to begin to lean in to the identity of Uyghur people. I guess I'll start with saying that Uyghur people are a Turkic people, which I didn't really know what that meant when I started out. I just knew that it must have something to do with the country Turkey. That is basically the extent that I knew about what it meant to be Turkic. But it turns out, if you know anyone's unfamiliar, that there is kind of a wide spectrum of Turkic identities. Countries such as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan. Some of these, there are also in a similar fashion to like say Kurdistan, not a Turkic country. That not all of these are necessarily formally recognized. Much like Xinjiang is not formally recognized as like its own country. But the Turkic history is extremely deep, rich, complicated, and I'm not an expert in it. But it is, I guess, to give like an illustrative example, it is very easy depending on the matchup of languages. So for example, if an Uyghur person or someone who speaks Uyghur runs into someone from, especially say, to give an example that would make sense, like Uzbekistan, those two people could have a conversation in their respective languages and do pretty well and not necessarily need to, neither one would need to stop using their own language. Yeah. So, in addition to being a Turkic people, also a deep part of Uyghur identity traditionally is Muslim identity, going back to about, to choose a point specifically in time, like about the 17th century, their Islamization begins throughout the Xinjiang area. I don't firmly understand all of the ins and outs of history of this region that far back. I really begin to be more with the events at the start of like the 20th century. And I definitely have at least one. I've spoken to one Uyghur person who's my friend who does not identify with Islam. I definitely don't want to present that like every Uyghur person deeply identifies with Islam, but historically, certainly, culturally, certainly, that is a deep part of not only the Uyghur identity, but also the aspect of Uyghur identity that the Chinese government has really leaned into in persecuting the Uyghur people. That's where I'm going to leave. There's much, much, much more to say about the Uyghur people. And I really have to stop myself from doing so because there's so much I would love to say. But that's an overview of just who we're talking about. We're going to be talking less about what defines the Uyghur people as Uyghurs and talk about what has come against them, which is something that I've definitely heard voiced by Uyghur people that is frustrating, to say the least, that they have sort of been, the conversation about who they are has been so defined by what has come against them. So I would just, I'd put that in your mind. You know, there's so much more to know about Uyghurs than what we're about to talk about going forward from here. But this is this is China, and in red here is Xinjiang as we know it. I am really hoping this is not cut off by this little Firefox hover over that is on my screen. Ideally, you should be able to see that I've also written East Turkestan and Uyghurstan, which are alternate names for this same region. Xinjiang is a Chinese, Mandarin Chinese term that literally means new frontier, and it's generally not appreciated by Uyghur people, to say the least. It was a name that came around along the way in about, I want to say in the 1800s, as the sort of older, like imperial Chinese Qing dynasty, I want to say. I don't know how to pronounce that definitely, but sort of was in the process of solidifying power in the region. So most Uyghur people tend to refer to the region as East Turkestan, and in fact there were a combined time of about 5 years where not the entire region, but parts of the region did have independence from China as a nation called East Turkestan. They both, in both instances, they took that name. This was taking place, between the first instance was 1933 to 1934, not even a full year. The second East Turkestan Republic was from 1944 to 1949. Had a bit more longevity, but in both cases they eventually were reclaimed by the Chinese government, and 1949 is the last time that there was any kind of an independent Uyghur state. So basically, oh, and I'm so sorry, Uyghurstan being another name that is never been in official use, or at least not for any sort of like modern state. Way back, I want to say in like the year 800 or like the 800s, there was a much older, I suppose, settlement of people related distantly to modern Uyghurs who use this name. It occasionally is used now. I think it does a great deal to provide some clarity about who Uyghurs are, because I think that is one of the first places where people in the United States, or just in the West perhaps generally, start to sort of stumble and sort of turn their minds off a bit with respect to this issue. Because it's like I had literally never heard of an Uyghur person prior to like 3 years ago, and I think that's generally the case for most people. And it doesn't help that when you try to think it through, it's like, where would an Uyghur person come from? I don't know of like a country or a place with that name, and that's how we think of basically everybody else. Even on this map, I could refer right here to Kazakhstan. We think of those as Kazakh people, etc. So I sort of lean into the name, and I used it for my little community Finding Uyghurstan, because I think it provides a little bit of that clarity. But there's not really a consensus, except that I don't think anybody really wants to stick with Xinjiang. People will use it to refer. I tend to call the region Xinjiang if I'm speaking of it in the context of Chinese control. If I'm talking about, for example, the re-education camps that we'll be talking about in a moment, I tend to refer to those as being in Xinjiang. So these are interchangeable. But already you can kind of see that the history of this region gets very dense very quickly as you look into it. Before we move on from this map, I also want to draw your attention to the fact that this is a number of reasons why the Chinese government might be so insistent on holding on to this territory. So for one thing, that is not a small chunk of China. I don't have a number in front of me on exactly how much of its landmass this represents, but it would be quite a different looking China without that region under control. And also we see that there are a number of borders with other nations that China would not share without this region. So this little bit of Russia here, the whole border with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan right here, a very small border with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India right here. Have I left any out there? It also does share with Mongolia, of course, but that's not the only border with Mongolia. In addition to all that territory, access to other countries, there are a number of precious resources in Xinjiang. There is oil, of course, that speaks for itself. I'm not going to list literally every resource here, but oil is a large one, and probably the largest is cotton. Xinjiang specifically is the largest producer of cotton in the world. Around 20% of the world's cotton comes from here, and that again is going to tie heavily into what is going on in the region. And yeah, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but not only the resources, but also a workforce here as well to cultivate those resources and share them with the mainland, or not mainland, but the rest of China and the rest of the world. In addition to that, my next slide deals with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is generally a large series of infrastructure projects that have been in progress and very important economically to China since about 2013. I don't understand it on a very detailed level, but it times very closely the beginning of this project to about 2013 with the worst of what has come against the Uyghur people from the Chinese government, which it's difficult to choose an exact starting time for when that is. And if you go far enough back, I mean, the oppression has been going on for a long time, but I think everyone starts to agree that it escalates to the level of genocide, certainly at 2017 at the absolute latest. So there's a bit of a transparent incentive for China as well with that. In particular, as they were developing the Belt and Road project, there came I think two, if I'm remembering correctly, two incidents of violence from Uyghur separatists. I mean, like that's how it's talked about in the press, and I haven't researched it thoroughly enough to definitely give my own opinion there. I feel like the wording is a bit skewed, perhaps, but I can't say that for sure. But there were attacks on civilians by Uyghur people that were taken very seriously by the Chinese government, obviously, and basically kickstarted everything that we think of as going on in the modern time. And it is there's definitely an argument to be made that this part of why the Chinese government was so unwilling to accept instability in the region at this time was because it was so focused on this Belt and Road Initiative. And those are the practical things that China is in it for. I do also get the sense that there is a bit of pride and a bit of I think they're, if you will, sort of drinking their own Kool-Aid a bit. I hear a lot of repeated phrases that I think they certainly have sunk into their own minds, or that's my take on it. Phrases like national sovereignty, ethnic unity, national harmony, things like this that I believe are just ideological motives for wanting to maintain control over Xinjiang. All right, so that is a background on who we're talking about, where we're talking about. I'm now going to try to condense a whole lot. This is going to be like a steamroller, and it's going to be very difficult to hear and for me to say. But here we go. So, oh, did I? No. Okay, hold on. Why do I have that out of place? That's embarrassing. All right. I guess I just meant to show that when I was talking about cotton. So sorry, there's a headline about more than 500,000 forced to pick cotton. My bad. That does appear a second time as well in a little bit. But, all right, so factual points that I'm basically going to target different aspects of what constitutes the genocide exactly. I think everyone who's at all familiar with the issue knows that there's a lot of bad stuff going on. They probably know some of the worst of it, but actually breaking apart individual components of what makes up this genocide against Uyghur people. I'm first focusing on the crackdown, one of the earliest things that happened, you start to hear about this, I believe, around like 2011 or so, is criminalization of like Uyghur education in general. And some of the first people to be targeted in the crackdowns, before we really even understood that a crackdown was underway, were Uyghur intellectuals, and especially Uyghur authors of textbooks that were written in the Uyghur language. They were arrested, and some of them sentenced to death, as you'll see referenced here in this headline, for their role in writing some of these textbooks, with claims being made that they were sort of secretly inserting separatist information or that sort of thing, which I haven't read these books, to be fair, but I feel safe in saying was not the case. Also has been present pretty much from the beginning is especially with the nature of those attacks that I mentioned that took place and kickstarted a lot of this, is criminalization of religious practice, specifically Islam. In fact, let me just not mince words here. It's just Islam. This is not really happening in the region of Xinjiang, at least, with any other religion. There are quite frivolous charges that exist that have been the justifications for people being arrested, being taken to re-education camps. As frivolous as growing a long beard is something that people have been arrested for. Something as simple as owning a Quran in your house, that has gotten people taken away. I'm a bit unclear that it's not the case that literally every mosque has disappeared, but in the hundreds and possibly thousands have been physically torn down. I think others have been like shuttered or repurposed for other things. And all of the rhetoric, almost all of the rhetoric about that is used by the Chinese government about Uyghurs, centers around religion, religious extremism, and the basis of the re-education camps that, again, we'll be talking about very soon, focus on re-educating religious extremists. That's the idea behind it, that was marketed, basically. I just talked about this a little bit, but in addition to, it's not only religious sites that have been destroyed, also just important cultural sites, in particular, that come to my mind are some very famous, like, marketplaces. We call them bazaars, and they are a very beloved aspect of Uyghur culture, that have been, many of the most famous have been either torn to the ground or repurposed. I've read some as well about like burial sites. Just I haven't done a deep dive into all of the various sites that have been targeted by this, but many Uyghur spaces, even on the level of entire villages in some cases, are just becoming less and less recognizable with time, if they're not already unrecognizable. All right, so now we're on the big one, that is generally what everyone knows about, the re-education camps, so-called. They are essentially, I looked into at a point when I was first researching this, can I or can I not describe these as concentration camps? And I was surprised to find that there isn't, at least to the ability, to my best ability to look into this, whether or not you designate a facility like this a concentration camp is a matter of editorializing. I would absolutely call these concentration camps. They are extremely restrictive prisons where people are taken for generally next to nothing. In this particular instance, I think it's a bit of a disservice to focus on only we call them sort of re-education camps pejoratively now in the West. And it's probably a term that's going to stick, but they are, just to be very clear, they are torture prisons, among other things. And I'm going to cover some specific things that happen here. I'm going to try to strike a balance between not being overly gratuitous and but I feel that it's important to linger a little bit on the kinds of things that go on at these facilities. We've heard a number of testimonies from survivors. There have been books written. That's where a lot of our information is firsthand. There is also some not secondhand, but like academic level information as well. We've analyzed like purchases of cattle prods and that kind of thing, for example, in high volume. But anyway, so frequent things that definitely happen in these kinds of facilities on a very large systematic scale. Torture by electrocution, forced stress positions, meaning like if that's not obvious, putting the body into a position that is inherently painful to be in, and then, restraining people to that position. We have things like being isolated for long periods of time in dark underwater, in rooms, it's hard to even describe this, that are filled almost entirely with water, up to the point where a person is just sort of able to breathe but nothing really else. Deprived from light, definitely deprived from contact with anyone else. So really deliberately cruel things. And yeah, I don't know, it leaves a terrible taste in the mouth, as I already said, but there's a lot to be said about that. But it is yeah, it's terrible, and it definitely shows a zealousness to cause suffering. I believe it sort of goes beyond, really, honestly, the intended effects of all of the policies that we see. I think there is an element where bad people have been put in positions where they can make these kinds of decisions within something that is already very bad, I guess. I won't linger on it too much beyond that. I would be... yeah, so I'm going to come back to some other things that happen in these facilities, but I definitely wanted to hit on those while it was introduced. But we do have forced control of birth, forced sterilizations. These happen largely in the camps, not exclusively in the camps. We have separation of families. This happens in a number of ways. This happens, of course, when someone is arrested and taken to a camp or to just a normal prison. This also happens... but especially if both parents are taken in this way, the state will take custody of a child and bring them to what is called like an orphanage, a boarding school. I've heard them called kindergartens at times. These are all being translated from Mandarin, so I'm not sure which applies best. And not only is that by itself one of the tenets of genocide, forcibly removing children of the group to of another group. This is also, they're not really being treated especially well at these boarding schools either. And in some cases, I believe that probably the most extreme forms of torture are probably not brought into these children's facilities, but I have definitely read accounts of some forms of torture being used against these children. Which, just devastating to say out loud. I feel like that's going to keep hitting me every time I have to say something like that. But, this is all being made possible through really historically unprecedented mass surveillance that is made possible by recent technology. We've had cameras for a long time, of course, but we have really unprecedented ability to process large amounts of data, and we also have artificial intelligence assisted technologies that make things like very accurate facial recognition possible, and widespread audio surveillance. It is specifically this is generally true throughout China, I'm led to understand, but specifically within Xinjiang, it is fair to say that if someone wants to be paying attention to what you're doing, there is really no space that you can go to that is not like the wilderness, where they will not be able to know what you are doing, what you're saying, who you're with, especially if you have, even if you don't, but especially if you're carrying a phone or anything like that. It's just pretty much game over in that sense. But besides the digital surveillance, I must not have put in a slide about this, and that is a mistake. But we also have in-person, so we have an incredibly strong police presence, a very heavily militarized police that, so for one thing, they're dispersed very densely throughout Xinjiang. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there was a point in time, I don't know if this is necessarily up-to-date information, but at the height, at least, of the police presence, there would be police checkpoints every city block in major cities. There are physical, like, I've seen footage of like apartment complexes that require facial scans to enter a building. And we've even had Chinese government officials stationed to live with families for extended periods of time for the purpose of monitoring what they do. Also, probably just to intimidate, frankly. And one can imagine for sure that that facilitated a good deal of abuse within those homes as well. More recently, so what I've been talking about has been going on for a number of years. Just in the much more recent past, the situation changed in that I don't have super firm times on when exactly this started and when exactly this could be said to have ended. But definitely most recently during the sort of like controversy over China's continued intense COVID lockdowns, whereas the rest of the world had largely started to move to a more moderate model. This was certainly weaponized against the entire region of Xinjiang, to the point that many literally died of starvation, as you can see in this headline here, 22 in a single day when this article was written. And this became sort of an unexpected flashpoint where we actually saw some rare protests in Xinjiang. That is not a safe thing to do, and we do not see that often, but there were protests for a time in Xinjiang after 10 people were killed in a fire that they were unable to escape because they had been physically locked into their dwelling, and other COVID-related measures prevented firefighters from effectively containing the fire. And that actually, yeah, I don't know, I feel that people who weren't following Uyghur issues in general probably would not be aware that this is really where the wave of anger that took over China for a couple of weeks there and resulted in such a quick reversal of China's strict lockdown policies really began in Xinjiang, in Urumqi. And I honestly, I haven't, yeah, I myself should probably actually look into the most recent information on this specifically, because it is some of the most recent stuff that's come out. And I will just briefly, as an aside, admit that I had to refresh myself on a lot of this information for this presentation, because I found there came a point where it was not useful to me to just have all of this memorized and be up to date on all of it. It was more bringing me down than it was really enabling me to do anything helpful. So I should follow up really and see what the latest with that is, because the last update I really got was around what I just said. So if I remain in contact with any of you and you want follow-ups on that, I'll try to provide that. All right, moving on, and I really need to try to hurry, but it's so hard to hurry any of this information. It's also important, but I will make an effort to do that. Forced labor has been a big issue in Xinjiang. That's another conspicuous one that people tend to know about. It's not just cotton, but that is a big industry that is impacted. I believe that's where a lot of it started. At this point, I'm led to understand that it is really across industries, and it is even beyond Xinjiang. I'm led to understand that people are taken out of Xinjiang to be forced to work in places outside of the region as well, which is relevant. I'll come back to, I suppose, but is relevant as countries have taken steps to limit exports, or imports, I should say, from Xinjiang, because that is not necessarily totally effective for the reason that it's not all coming from that region necessarily. But this is my last point before we transition into the international response, what has actually happened on the ground there. Well, actually, I guess this is specifically definitionally not on the ground there. This is the fact that, in addition to everything I've talked about, Uyghurs who have managed to escape China, or often this more means that they left China in times when it was easier to do that, times prior to the camps opening and strict restrictions on travel, strict restrictions on communication, and therefore were already out of the country. But in any case, regardless of how they left, China has been, I'm led to understand, in an unprecedented way, very dogged about pursuing Uyghurs outside of its borders. This can take the form, well, first of all, the easiest example of this is that countries that are very friendly with China and not very interested in pressing China on these issues will just deport Uyghurs back. This has happened. I don't have a list in front of me. I believe this has happened. I shouldn't speculate. I feel like I remember some by name, but I'm not going to go out and potentially say something false here. But this is definitely happened on it. It's like more than half of the globe, slightly, where this is a risk of happening. I'll say that, and I would refer you all specifically, if you want to know more about this, to the Uyghur Human Rights Project's report called Transnational Repression. It's where I got a lot of my original information about this. But besides being just deported from a country which is hostile to Uyghurs, we have heard voicemails being left, calls and voicemails being left by the Chinese government to Uyghurs to just pressure them to come back. And the way that they often do this is via blackmailing them with threats against their family, or promises to allow them to be in contact with their family, which is just sort of a honeypot type of situation. It's just a trap. Often they will want, if they are not pressuring these Uyghurs to come back right at that moment, they will pressure them to engage in spying activity on other members of the diaspora, which has gone a very long way to sow distrust within the diaspora, and has been one of the most probably effective things the Chinese government has done. Again, much more I could say about that, but in general, China has definitely. This is, I think, a little bit of why some countries have taken some initiative, because it is alarming to even them, who might not otherwise necessarily care that much, that China has felt empowered to act in their territory, realistically. All right, so moving on to international response now. It was pretty slow all around until just a couple years ago. It feels very slow, to be honest with you, but in the scheme of things, it's been a very fast-paced couple years for international response on this, considering that at the latest we would consider 2017 the starting point of the genocide overall. In 2020, I would roughly say, is when we started to get some more major responses. I am going a little bit out of order here, though. What you're seeing on the screen is from just last year. This was where a lot of people's eyes were. There was, for a long time, very strong calls for the Human Rights Council of the United Nations to investigate Xinjiang specifically to gain, I believe the official phrasing that was used was unfettered access to the region, and to produce a report on it. And that took a very, very long time. There was stalling for multiple years on that. At the time, High Commissioner of the Human Rights Council was Michelle Bachelet, I think is how you say her name. Sorry if I'm wrong on that. Eventually did visit the region in May of last year, and at the time it was considered very disappointing. There were definitely not particularly strong condemnations. It was fairly neutral, and it seemed like nothing was really going to come out of the Human Rights Council. But then we were surprised, interestingly, in the final minutes of Michelle Bachelet's term as the High Commissioner, she then released a report which did specifically, it did not use the word genocide in the report, but it did say that China was likely to be committing crimes against humanity in Xinjiang against the Uyghur people. And that was obviously very reassuring, very promising. But soon after that, in October of last year, the Human Rights Council held a vote on just to discuss the issues that were raised in Michelle Bachelet's report, and the measure failed by about 3 votes, which really blunted the United Nations' ability to continue forward with this issue. This is really one of the last major things that has come out of the United Nations. I don't think the United Nations is entirely out for the count on this, but it is definitely much more ambiguous how it can proceed from here, because this was, again, not even a measure to do anything specific about the situation. This was just a measure to open the council up to discuss the issue. And I will just note, it is the second time in the Human Rights Council's history that a motion has failed. So very discouraging there. The only other, before I move on to a different entity here, there was very recently, I don't really know how important this is, but just in the last month or so, I believe, what is it, CESCR, Council for Economics, I really should have written out what the acronym stands for, I apologize, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, something along those lines. Very sorry for not having that specifically in front of me. Recently released a report which was pretty scathing to China, but it ultimately doesn't, I don't believe it has any actionable follow-up. So disappointing there overall. There is not a clear path forward that I am aware of for the United Nations to make meaningful progress on this issue, particularly with, obviously China wields a great deal of influence over like these countries that led this vote, but they also hold permanent status on the Security Council, and obviously just have an undue amount of influence over, the investigations that we might conduct into them and measures that might be imposed against them. Moving on to the International Criminal Courts, there's nothing very positive to say about this. This was in 2020. They formally said that they did not feel that they had jurisdiction to act on this because China is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. And what's interesting about that is that, as you all, I would be very surprised if you all were not aware that this same International Criminal Court this year took a very dramatic step. Do I have a slide for this? Oh, well, I have the Rome Statute here, but took the very dramatic step of issuing an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, which is obviously a head of state of a very powerful nation. And Russia is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. Ukraine is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. So how did they do this? You'll see in my highlighting here that the court may exercise its functions and powers as provided in the statute on the territory of any state party and by special agreement on the territory of any other state. So I feel like I can state as a matter of fact that they could have chosen to intervene in this issue and conspicuously did not want to, and that's very disappointing. Yes, I do have a slide here. ICC judge issues arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin, and that person's name, who I do not know how to pronounce or know very much about them, if I'm honest with you. And the only other international body I'm going to talk about is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, just as a sort of... they are a body of 57 members of primarily Muslim-majority countries who are generally reflective of... There's a lot I could say about individual members of this body, but just what they do as a group is fairly reflective. So they have not only been fairly reluctant to intervene, but in fact have definitely given statements praising the Chinese government for its policies in Xinjiang, and that is very startling generally to people first learning about the situation. Maybe not as much if you're from one of those countries, perhaps, or are more familiar with them. It was not the information that I was expecting to learn, and it definitely begs the question why, because this group is generally very supportive of the whenever Muslims are persecuted in most other contexts. And I'm going to make we could probably spend an entire talk on why this is the stance they've taken, but I'm going to return to this map and point out that the continuation of this line that we've already talked about, being a very strong economic incentive for China, goes right through the Middle East and where a lot of these countries are, and many investments have been made. Loans, essentially, like infrastructure loans, have been given from China to many of these countries. So that's certainly playing a factor, I'm comfortable saying. So we are moving away from international organizations, international governmental bodies, to individual countries. I'm just going to talk about the U.S. and Canada pretty much for the time being, not because they're the only ones that matter. The U.S. is pretty important in this, but they're just they're familiar to us, and I don't really need to explain the context of them, really. There are definitely other things I could focus on, but these are close to home, and so the U.S. Congress has passed 2 laws so far and is considering a third relative to Uyghur issues. The Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2020 basically required that the executive branch, it mandated that the executive branch report on various aspects of the Uyghur Genocide to Congress. I believe it established a couple positions within the government. And then, I don't know why this lost its short name, this second one, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It's still called that by government officials, so I don't know why it doesn't show up on this page about it. But this essentially creates what is called a rebuttable presumption on importers of any products to the U.S. that if those products came from Xinjiang, they're assumed to have been made with forced labor and therefore illegal to import. But the importer can prove otherwise if they're able to do that. This, as I was hinting at a little bit before, is good. Both of these things are very good. But I feel that they are potentially going to fall short. I know that there have already been some concerns about some things getting around the Forced Labor Prevention Act in a variety of ways. And also, as I mentioned, it doesn't even necessarily target the entire issue, because the entire Chinese economy really is so interconnected, for one thing. And also, there are reports of Uyghurs being taken out of the Xinjiang region and put to forced labor in other regions. So this is not even necessarily complete in the first place. But it's definitely a lot better than nothing. I do think that we have... and I'm sorry, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. We were the first country also to formally declare the situation a genocide, and a couple others followed suit. But this happened, strangely enough, on the Trump administration's final day in office, and that is... I don't really know what to make of that, but it's worth keeping in the back of our minds for the future, perhaps, why the timing was that way. But that is how it happened. The very final day of the Trump administration in 2021, the U.S. formally recognized, and the Biden administration continues that recognition. It is unlikely to go anywhere at this point. We are a leader on this issue internationally, as much as I do have criticisms for the U.S. government on this. Those criticisms mainly being what you see here. As far as I'm able to tell at the time that this article was written, and as far as I'm able to tell in the meantime, we have literally not admitted any Uyghur refugees, period. We do have, according to the Uyghur Human Rights Project, between 500 and 1,000 Uyghurs who are in the asylum-seeking process, but that is not the same thing as being admitted initially as a refugee. And also, as they point out, those are taking upwards of 8 years to have those resolved, with them not knowing if they will be able to remain in the U.S. or be potentially deported back to China. As you can imagine, that's a very important distinction. Those are two very different outcomes. And I feel that the U.S. is very much lacking in this area, and I've only been working on these issues for a little under 2 years, as I said. I am definitely building momentum towards focusing myself on applying pressure to the government on this issue, on admitting refugees. I personally feel that is something that is not getting enough attention, really, in many places. And we could be. I think the first step needs to be providing material protection to Uyghur people, and then everything else following from that. But this was a letter sent from the Uyghur American Association to the United States Customs and Immigration Service. Is that right? Geesh, again, I should not just use acronyms. I apologize for that. The agency overseeing refugee admissions. And I don't have the full letter. This is just a shot to talk about it. Basically presenting these issues in a very good way. Well written, gets to the issues, and they were provided a response that basically just said, we're sorry, but we will not be changing anything about how we're doing things, which is very disappointing. Almost more, I don't know, this is a personal take, but almost more insulting than no response at all in some ways, but that's obviously a personal opinion. That's a bit ahead. I did recently, like as I was writing this presentation, become aware that the Biden administration has made some general reforms to the refugee admission system that will be helpful to Uyghurs. It's not specific to Uyghurs at all. I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit. But so there is some general positive movements that may help Uyghurs in the long run, and I could praise the U.S. government for somewhat, and I haven't had time to look more into it since I became aware of it just this week. But generally they stem from an executive order that Joe Biden made in 2021. And I'll talk about what I know about it here towards the end. The last thing on second to last, right? Yeah. These are three. There are far more than these. There are at least like 10 NGOs out there that deal with Uyghur issues and are run by Uyghur people. These are three of the most prominent: World Uyghur Congress, the East Turkestan Government in Exile, and the Uyghur Human Rights Project. It's a little bit what the World Uyghur Congress and the East Turkestan Government in Exile do are a little bit nebulous. The one is the East Turkestan Government in Exile, literally claims to be the government in exile, of course. World Uyghur Congress, even though it does use that phrase Congress there, I don't believe they are making a claim to be a government in exile in the same way. I've gone through their websites, and it is genuinely a little bit hard to figure out exactly what it is that they're doing. They tend to both release press releases on relevant issues. There are some claims made by the East Turkestan Government in Exile that they sort of are democratically elected and sort of report back to the diaspora communities, but I have not heard anything about that from the diaspora community that I've been connected to. So I can't really speak to what they're up to, but they're definitely worth knowing about and having in mind. The Uyghur Human Rights Project, I have incredible amounts of praise for. They've put out, I think, 17, somewhere close to that, very in-depth reports that contain very actionable information written, intended to be read by people in positions of power. They're doing outstanding work, and I would recommend you check out some of what they've written. They also get involved in some of the same things that these other ones do. Now that I think about it, it would have made sense to flip these next two slides, but that's okay. I'll dip away to the Uyghur Tribunal, which was a sort of people's trial, essentially, that was led by some prominent lawyers. I don't know enough about their careers, and I don't have them listed here by name. But like prominent people who had been involved in human rights work, and some high-profile human rights international legal cases. So this was not in any way legally binding, but this was run by people who were respected in the legal community, who essentially held a tribunal and considered the evidence and made a judgment which, beyond reasonable doubt, the People's Republic of China committed torture and crimes against humanity against the Uyghurs, and by imposition of measures to prevent births, intended to destroy a significant part of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, as such committed genocide. That was in December of 2021. That was released. And the last thing I have to talk about that has a slide and that is part of the factual background is this sort of anticlimactic, because I don't really have a lot of information about it, but there has, as of last year and sort of later in last year, been a criminal case filed against the Chinese government in Argentina on the grounds that Argentina allows in its constitution, I believe in its constitution, the concept of your universal jurisdiction. So it opens its courts to be hosts of international issues like this. I have not been able to find any updates since the suit was filed. It's promising, and it is backed by the plaintiffs in the case are the World Uyghur Congress and the Uyghur Human Rights Project that we just talked about. But I have not seen any updates about it on their websites. This is something to follow. It is potentially another avenue. It could end up being a large development, but at the moment, there's not much that I'm able to tell about it. All right, so that is the end of my factual background, prepared slides, and I'm just going to talk a little bit personally about unpacking some of this. If you think like me, then you will notice that a lot of these efforts kind of feel like they're going nowhere, and that's deeply frustrating. Basically, I suspected this before the situation in Ukraine broke, but we've definitely seen definitively from the situation in Ukraine that all of these various bodies, individual countries, international bodies, the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, they could have chosen to take more of a definitive stance on the issues, the genocide against Uyghurs. And they didn't, and it just appears that they feel that they have more of a personal stake in the issues in Ukraine. Yet another piece of very disappointing information. But I would, it's important for us to stay abreast of what is happening through these channels, but I have, as I sort of hinted at before, when I see an article that is of the effect, I did end up reading to give this presentation, but like when I saw, for example, a headline recently, yet another UN committee has weighed in on, has I don't remember the exact phrasing, but has lambasted the Chinese government for its abuses against Uyghurs, and I didn't even read that when I saw it, because I just knew that it was going to be more of the same, and that's been a very repetitive process for the last 2 years for me, and sort of being disillusioned and trying to figure out why then, like where I should put my hope, if any, and I do have hope, but what I expected when I first got involved in all of this and what I expect now are very different from each other. So I would encourage you to consider the following question. What is the best possible outcome for Xinjiang and Uyghurs right now? Like, not even the best realistic outcome, but like the best logically comprehensible outcome that could happen if all hostilities ended and all effort was put towards repairing damage. It would not, there is nothing that would be anything that we would call short term, even under those very best of circumstances, that could patch over what has happened so far. Any way it happens at this point, the issue of the Uyghur Genocide is a very, very long-term issue. It will exceed our lifetimes, and it will probably exceed the lifetime of probably the generation that follows us. I would imagine. That's especially relevant for Uyghurs themselves, as there is this great interruption in the ability to transmit culture and maintain families across the current generational divide. But basically, the point I'm trying to make is that the Uyghur Genocide is, at this point, a very long game, and I understand it's why it would be there's no doubt that regardless of if you get involved in it or not, it's difficult just to know about. I felt that my life changed from the first article that I read about this, and I could have gotten off the train at that point, and it still would have followed me through my life, I feel, a bit. But especially the more that you engage with it, it is so difficult. It's very painful, and it I don't know. There's no getting around that. But I do believe that people should get involved, particularly people who have. I think everyone can do something towards this. Everyone can at least foster a basic recognition of who the Uyghur people are. Look out for like Uyghur establishments in their community. You might be surprised to find, for example, that you have like an Uyghur restaurant nearer to you than you might realize, or that sort of thing. You might realize that there's like an Uyghur school near you, not like a public school or anything, but like a sort of like a weekend school is what they tend to be, where Uyghur children go to ideally learn the Uyghur language. I don't know exactly how many, but a handful of those throughout the country, the U.S. There are points of I would like to see everyone, just every person on Earth, have at least a basic recognition of who the Uyghurs are, what's going on, more or less. And I think everyone having that knowledge by itself would be a good thing, so that by extension, people who are more involved, spreading awareness to people, even if those people don't get very, very involved in the cause, that awareness is a very necessary amount of groundwork that we need to lay. But my case for people getting more involved in committing more of their lives to this is that you're not going to see particularly immediate results. There's going to be a lot of disappointment even beyond what we've already talked about. I've been through it a bit, and I will go through more of it, but if we think of, I guess if we think of the long-term prospects of all of this, they're like already the amount of work that I've invested over the last 2 years in learning the language. I haven't really talked too much, I guess, about what I've done over the last 2 years, but learning the language to an intermediate extent, forming a group where people talk about these issues and share language and culture, etc. The genocide is very much still going on, and I have not done very much to interrupt it in the scheme of things. But even in that short time, it is a different landscape than when I started. And I had to go through a lot of this really completely alone, and that was overwhelming, and I had this constant feeling like I was never going to get anywhere. And now, even in just a short amount of time, relatively, the landscape is different. People who get involved in this do not necessarily have to start from that place of total isolation, and that's possible because I had a vision for the long term, and I understood that there is never going to come a point where we're done working on this, where we're done attempting to recover or lend our assistance in helping the Uyghur people to recover from what has come against them. So I would make the argument that if you want to help, but you know that you are only concerned about like what can I do that will end this, that does not exist, and I don't necessarily know what to recommend for someone who is thinking about it in that way. But if you are willing to give parts of yourself, your time, and allow some of this pain into your life, in 10 years from now, there will be no doubt that it was worthwhile to get involved in whatever way that is most appropriate for you to do, best corresponds to you, your background, your skill set. there are a lot of things that people could be doing that I just will not be. They're not my forte. Like preservation of like history comes to mind. I'm just not. I have people in my circle who are much better suited to that sort of thing than I am. So whatever your point of entry into the issue ends up being, I encourage you to go forward with it, even if you are not really sure where it's going. And that would be where I would end. The last thing I'm going to say is it's a little out of place. I apologize for that, but I did recently learn that it is possible. As of this year, the federal U.S. government is rolling out a program called the Welcome Corps, which is going to make it possible for groups of 5 individuals or more, if they meet some criteria, raise a certain amount of funds, to sponsor refugees to come to the United States. So that is actually information that I only learned because I was writing this talk. And I would say that one thing just demonstrates the value of talking about these issues with each other. I've had more than one experience like that where I had information that was accessible the entire time, but I only did come to access it when I talked to other people. But that is about to be, as soon as I put this talk behind me, that is about to become the focus of my work. I think that is an incredibly important opportunity. And I would encourage people to potentially look into that and maybe get in touch with me about that. I don't know. I haven't had a lot of time to think about it yet, but that is a very powerful opportunity indeed. So sorry to kind of tack that onto the end, but goodness, I'm now done so far over time. I'm really, really sorry to everyone for how far over time it is. But I am done, and we can open to questions. I will do my best to answer, and if I don't have an immediate answer for you, I will get an answer to you. Yeah, absolutely. It's called the Welcome Corps, Corps as in CORPS. It, I believe, has a dedicated government website that I think is just like welcomecorps.gov. Let me check that really fast, actually. Welcome Corps. What do I find? Yeah, welcomecorps.org, I guess, which is surprising. I would have expected that to be a .gov. But I also read, I know that I am a little surprised that it's not a .gov site, but I did read a State Department release about it as well, which was a .gov domain, so it's definitely a real thing. And yeah, it's, I haven't had a lot of time to look into it, but that is, yeah, it looks very promising, and like it is pretty flexible. So hopefully, yeah, we can get some progress made via that. If you guys think of any questions and want to follow up with me, feel free. I would also encourage anyone who's interested in participating in this issue long term to join Finding Uyghuristan, our Discord server, where a lot of really first, like, one of a kind conversations are happening. It's a forum that needed to exist, and it's very new, it's very small, very humble, and very complicated, frankly. But I do think it is. I do think it is an important forum that exists now. So I would encourage people to come there, because you will definitely find very quickly that there is a desert of information and connection outside of that. But yeah, that's the last thing I have to say.